Thanks. So I want to, first of all, thank all of the folks who presented today. It has been fantastic to see this much work happening in a relatively short space of time from a government perspective. I also am going to be expecting an increased curve of work, because a lot of that time the last few months was just getting our feet under us. And it sounds like all of the working groups have a pretty clear focus. Jim, do you have a timeline for the proof of concept, or at least when you want it to be operational by?
Yeah, our goal is to have it completed by end of Q1 for Q1 and calendar year.
All right, so he's going to have it by end of Q1 calendar year for 2019. So that'll be after the February meeting, but you'll be able to give us an update then. Yeah.
Yeah, we should definitely have a lot to talk about.
Fantastic. Yeah. And so again, keeping in mind that our next chance to all come together is going to be in February. There's a lot of things to be done between now and then. So we have about 20 minutes till our scheduled lunch break. And so what I thought we might do is, rather than diving straight into the problems, just take a few minutes to flag what are some of the open questions. And we may go back to one of the slides that the first group had. But I wanted to sort of do some brainstorming about what else you'd like to put on the table to talk about this afternoon. What do we need to explore as a group while we have this incredible brain trust both here and watching online? Josh, you have a thought.
It's somewhere in between his talk and what you just said. You correctly made me wait to hear from Afton until his chunk, but we haven't done that yet. So how can I know a little bit about the relationship between this activity and the FDA's regulatory action, but I don't think the whole room does. When do we hear that?
Well, so I'm going to give a very high-level discussion, and then I will let the representative for the FDA chime in, because I think one of the things we want to emphasize is this effort is meant to capture the entire interests of software community and the users of the software community, which frankly is the entire digital economy. One of our little buzzwords, a little duck should fall down the field and ceiling whenever an NTIA person says digital economy. But there is a lot of work ongoing. This is something that has been a priority for the National Health Sector Coordinating Council, as well as the FDA's medical device team. And Afton is in the room, and Seth is here. So there are a couple of things going on. One, there's an open, as Josh already talked about, there's an open call for comment. Folks are interested, we can put a link out there. I don't want to dive too much into the weeds, but I think, Afton, if there's something that you feel this community should know about what the FDA is doing in this space, it could be useful.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So as they said, we do currently have a draft revision of our pre-market guidance for medical device cybersecurity that is out, and as has been highlighted earlier, we did put a component in there that's relevant for this group as it relates to transparency, which we call it a cybersecurity bill of materials, because we also had some interest in understanding the hardware components. As well, recognizing that that can also be part of the threat vector. And what we are very excited about with this group is the work that is being done as it relates to the transparency. And even if we only get insight into some of the challenges as it relates to software, that is still very helpful for us and for industry and for our stakeholders. And so we very much appreciate the effort that is happening here, because we recognize that medical devices are just one of many verticals that have transparency concerns. And we very much have tried to, in our previous guidances, to leverage, if you will, other best practices across the different, verticals, because we do recognize that, medical devices definitely have some unique aspects, but they're also, part of the traditional IoT.
I think that's a fantastic point, which is there are going to be verticals where they say we have unique needs, and what we're hoping that the use case group will cast a wide enough net to sort of flag what's in common and what's unique to ICS, what's unique to regulated sectors versus unregulated sectors, et cetera. Further comments on, I guess, one last question on any last questions or anyone want to chime in on something else that is happening elsewhere in the U.S. government? Remember, this is one of the goals of this process is to make sure that you, as participants, can actually set the agenda on how we think about this issue of software transparency. Michael Eisenberg, I see that you are patiently waiting to chime in. Perhaps you have some thoughts on what are some of the open questions we should be tackling?
Alan, can you hear me all right?
We can, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to foot stomp on something that Steve Lipner said. As you know, we have been addressing the policy level of some of these considerations and their presentation within the interagency constellation across at least the civilian agencies of the federal government, and that community's role as an influencer over, as customers, over the behavior of the vendor community. The discussion this morning, I think, is a fantastic evidence of the importance and impending convergence of the practical boots on the ground work that the working groups of your process have done, and the concerns about developing guidance for the evolution of higher level policy that's both actionable by civilian agencies and consistent with shared objectives for improvement in vendor community practices and behavior change. So again, I really just want to foot stomp on the comment that Steve made about the importance of a strategic vision evolving, and the utility, I think, of integrating that vision with the existing direction of the Software Supply Chain Assurance Forum and some of the other parallel efforts that are going on in this space.
Thank you. And since you've talked about, and for those who don't know, Michael Eisenberg's with MITRE, and we just had, I think you just stepped out, one of the authors of the recent MITRE paper, Secure on Delivery, which is DoD focused, but one of the things they explicitly call out in supply chain security is the importance and potential of supply chain transparency for software. So it's nice to hear this being echoed around, and again, underscores the importance of the work that you guys are doing.
Well, and likewise, I mean, I think the convergences and the integrations are essential.
Thanks. So I think, it's been a busy morning. Some of you seem to be needing a refill on your coffee, but I'm going to suggest a few potential things that we can tackle when we return from lunch at 1:30. And you guys, what I'd like you to do is sort of chime in, either nods or just raise your hand and say, that's a terrible idea, and who the hell do you think you are anyway? So one of the ideas can be to revisit this question of modality or granularity, or sort of essentially getting to what Art and Michelle talked about this morning of what is a bill of materials. And if we can find some common ground, not necessarily thinking through the technical side, but just from an organizational and operational perspective, what do we want to include in this side of things? So that's one approach. The other aspect, which I don't think I've heard as much about, but a number of people have sort of touched on, is what does the act of transparency look like? So in some solutions, like SWID, it's fairly straightforward, where it ships with the binary, but that works when you are shipping a binary. So in other contexts, it may not. So what do people think about that? What are your concerns around different approaches to that? And then the final thing, this touches on something that Omar raised and a number of you have also touched on, which is the cloud side of things. So how do we think through on-prem versus off-prem? And then finally, if we still have some time, and I'll let you guys sort of over lunch think about which ones of these you want to talk through. All of the groups, as I understand them, have actually made some great progress in saying we want a lightweight software bill of materials. We're going to focus on what the components are. But a bunch of you have said, we need to still think about vulnerability data. And perhaps even as important, some way to communicate when the vendor says we're doing okay, actually. So what are some of the other data planes that we may want to think about not necessarily to address directly in sort of the crawl phase or the walk phase, but certainly we can start planning out as we start thinking about exploitability and how the vendor can sort of make it easy and sort of systematize the communication to say, don't worry about this. I know this is going to trip an alarm, but we've got it covered. Josh has a thought on this.
Just the phrase that keeps coming up for producers of software here is, how do I make an attestation that persists across stakeholders and time?
As always, you frame things more succinctly and better than I could. Thank you. So I've sort of listed 4 things. We'll make sure they're on the screen afterwards. Does anyone else have some further ideas of what else you would like to make sure that we, as a community, can tackle today? Sure.
Yeah, I just have actually a quick question, because this is something we have in our guidance document. Are we settled on the term SBOM? Because, I mean, I don't want to really open up a huge Pandora's box, but since we're all here, it would be nice to have that discussion, because I think, has been mentioned several times in the meeting just today, certainly gets brought up on our framing calls. SBOM does not really represent, I think, clearly what we're trying to do here. And it does seem to just liven up the conversation around, is this really what even when we had our conversation at the FDA meeting back last year, 2 years ago, that was one of the first things that came up when our topic was SBOM, and the first thing was, is this really what we want to call it? So I can tell by the laughs in the room that maybe I'm...
This is a great way to have the last 10 minutes and get everyone juiced up. I will say I'm a little sad that none of you just sort of picked up and started rolling the tongue-tripping software component transparency. I think it just rolls straight off the tongue. But now, who has thoughts on, other than you really shouldn't talk about it explicitly while you're standing in an airport? I've done this and had people say.
I just want to reference a document that was released during World War II by the Office of Strategic Services called the Simple Sabotage Manual. If anyone's read this, it's a guide for how to, if you don't want to be part of the resistance, but you're behind enemy lines in Germany, how to sort of sabotage things from within, quietly and safely. And then there's a short chapter on management. And one of the items in there is, anytime it looks like you're making progress, insist on a return to first principles and question the authority of the group to actually make decisions. And so, I think that there's a real concern in that the perfect can be the enemy of the good in all this. And so if it may be that SBOM is not an ideal term, it might be, but it might not be. But we run into real risks of hamstringing our efforts if there is not a strong case to be made for empirical and concrete reasons to get into the litigation of terminology. I just, it can be very, very, it could be a productivity grenade. And I think that we have to be cognizant that everybody's time here is valuable, and we're all professionals, and we need to make progress.
I've got John, Josh, and then Duncan.
So I don't disagree with any of that, but I think one of the cases that we need to think about is when it comes time, and it is time, it's going to increasingly be time, to talk about this with regulators, to talk about this with policymakers. Is software bill of materials going to resonate? I don't know the answer to that, but we need to think about that issue. We can use the term SBOM in this room. That's great. We all get it. Makes sense. No problem. We're ultimately not the people that really matter in all of this, right? It's going to be regulators. It's going to be policymakers. They're the ones that we have to convince ultimately. So if we think SBOM is the term that will do it, and you can see people on the Hill talking about SBOM this and SBOM that, then great. It's a perfectly good term. If not, then we might need to consider what other ways can we think about talking about this that will actually move the needle with the people whose needle needs to be moved.
So I kind of hate SBOM, and Just a couple independent points. A BOM, or bill of materials, is incredibly well-defined, well-rigored, understood by executives and board members in adjacent industries who are increasingly becoming software. So there's a ton of potentially positive patterns to be gleaned from adherence to the BOM, whether it's SBOM, SWBOM, whatever. Number two, I couldn't stand it when an executive branch person called this SBOM and made jokes and songs about it, but also the Congress folks that have been attracted to this are also using SBOM and have been, despite repeated attempts to get them to not do so. And number three, I think a lot of the people close to the pioneering of this and the capture state and practice kind of don't care what we call it, just that we do it, which is one of the reasons I keep going back to like that simple definition of ingredients and the use cases surrounding that. So we could have a word cloud of like adjacent words, but I think redefining it may set us back or slow us down, to your espionage point.
So I support the not renaming it. You can call it SBOM if the reason is you're worried about saying the word bomb. But as Josh said, BOM is a very established acronym, bill of materials in the supply chain. I don't think we should redefine logistics terms if we can avoid it. If you don't want to call it software in front of it, you want to call it something else, fine. But bill of materials, I think, is, unless I missed the point being made, bill of materials is what we're trying to make. Is the point we're not trying to make a bill of materials, or is the point people don't like BOM as an acronym?
So I'm going to step in here and say, does anyone have an alternative in mind? Does anyone have something that they're very excited about? Ideally something that makes a clever but really corny acronym? Okay, we'll continue, but I just want to keep this in mind. If we don't have an alternative, then...
Yeah, we actually had a number of them when we had this conversation with FTA. But that was our topic. Ken Hoyme and I led that topic. And just to be clear, I'm not opening this discussion point to make a big stink or try to set us back. It's an actual thing that we have on our agenda that we need to get resolved. And the more people we have here, and if that's the case that we are going to keep that, that's fine. It's just we have to be, in order to move on, we just need to be able to close it. So, and I'm not hearing any objections unless there are some objections. Just a topic.
Oh, okay. At the risk of stepping on Michelle's attempt to close the topic, I just wanted to say, as a former product designer, when you say bill of materials, something pops up in my head. I see a very, very clear picture. It's an Excel spreadsheet in my domain, and it's got a hierarchical format, and it's got stuff in it, and I know exactly what you're talking about. When you say software bill of materials, after participating in the files and formats thing, I have a picture in my head that is almost the same. It's really, really, really similar. It's XML, it may be something else, but I mean, it's a really similar thing. If you say bill of materials to someone who doesn't know what we're talking about, I think it's a very short path to convincing them that they do understand what you're talking about. It's just a little different.
Okay. So with that, unless someone comes back from their lunch break with a great idea of what we could frame this as, I am hearing that we are going to stay with this issue. And again, these matters are always open. If someone comes forward in a few months and said, I just came up with the most brilliant label and it will win friends and influence people all over the world, then we'll reopen this. But for now, I'm not hearing strong objections. I'm going to check on the phone. And Michael, I see you waiting in the queue, but I think, alas, we have some hungry people in this room. So we will pick this up at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time.